In the following video, I'm going to discuss the possibilities of socio-symbolization and something I call symbolic being. Now, essentially, the notion that there is, for philosophers such as Heidegger, a difference between ontic and ontological has something to do, in my mind, with the way things are represented to us, either as ontic, physical components dealing with the matter rather than form, and the ontological, which more or less is a function of form itself and the way things can be symbolized to us in image signs, which is more present in the work of Husserl, the idea that things can be represented in the mind and posited and visualized, than it is for Heidegger. We see that Heidegger, for instance, has the idea of a closed totality. So what we want to look at here with a closed totality concerning Heidegger is the notion that when things are in a closed totality, the way the image is represented to us is not necessarily found. It may be found only within relations, within community relations, and it's only demonstrated to us within said closure. It's not a function of the ability to actively, as Husserl does, posit an image and realize the genus of that image as something that leads through several stages of decision as to the actuality of the image, whether or not it is this, or Husserl uses the idea of the house, but it could be this person. So the process with the difference between Husserl and Heidegger is you have this idea with Husserl that he goes through the stages, the notion, the Aristotelian notion of genus, of a species, and takes it from the higher genus, or the universal idea, and then breaks it down into ultimately its particular components as to if you can actually perceive someone to be precisely who they are. So I would say in this instance, the notion of thinking of things as ontic, which the different term that Husserl uses is noetic, but it doesn't really mean the same thing as ontic. Noetic is something, you can think of it as a vertical totalization of the self, really, in a sense, in a perceptual manifold, whereby you see things because they're on the subject pole of consciousness. The noetic pole of consciousness is the subjective pole of consciousness. So I would say in this particular instance, with Husserl, what you're unable to do with Husserl, similarly as with Heidegger, is this totality is something universal to it. So it's getting at where both Husserl and Heidegger perhaps fail in the ability to get right at the person you are expecting to see out in the visual field is a function of the subjective pole being unable to sort of project the image beyond its instantiation upon the subjective pole, as such as it is this person or that person, and I have the identity entirely solved as to who is accessing me, who is the other, who is this being that is within me, this being that is concerned with me. But of course that being is really only represented by the other, which is there in the internal space. So I suggest that both Husserl and Heidegger, with Husserl's noetic pole and Heidegger's ontic, the idea of matter, that the subject reproduces matter, and so there's a distinction there as noetic form or noetic facts are essentially ideas about, what the parallel notion that in Heidegger is the idea of equiprimordial being. So noetic is really concerned mostly with ontological things upon the subjective pole of consciousness. Whereas, of course, the noema is the object itself. So that is considered the objective pole of consciousness, and work has been done to sort of advance this theory between the poles as such, between ontic and ontological, that essentially necessitated the notion that one would perceive a gap when ultimately in the sort of ideal landscape of the human internal scope of reality would perceive a gap between subjective pole and objective pole, and that matter and form would be something horizontal, what I call a horizontification, taking the word, the idea of a horizon, and Georgi Lukács's notion of reification, that horizontification is a way of abstracting from what I call what is the noematic pole of consciousness, really. But it's a produced world of objects that is there, and it's part of social production. It's on the horizon, and it has to do with what is being reproduced by society in regional totalities, and what we perceive when we reflect upon the presence of someone else in our minds, that a representation as such, or an other, or a being that is, perhaps we don't think should be there, which falls into the sort of auspices of numerous sort of forms of psychoanalysis, why there is an entity there that has we are not impervious to beings as such, and insofar as there are so many varying forms of humanity that at some point, to have this very pure sort of positing of the I, the pure positing of the I, between subjective pole, object, objective pole. So I think of both Husserl and Heidegger, Husserl the noetic and Heidegger the ontic. And then I think of the ontological as something that is really, for me, takes the form of something that is being reproduced or produced in this sort of. So if there is no social praxis going on, if nothing is being produced in the world, if people are not active and engaged in the praxis of human life and involved in situations and continuing to evolve their thinking and changing their thinking and trying to consider reality in new ways and sort of creating what I call manifold reality, which is a form of reality that is particular to individuals, but it's so occupied with itself in its form of production. And the varying points in history when people have tried to combine, for instance, Heidegger and Marx. In this particular instance, what I would like to do is combine Husserl and Marx. Not really combine them, there is no qualitative synthesis between Husserl and Marx, as it were, but I would like to take the aesthetics of Husserl and sort of bring them into the idea of sort of a horizontal form of social production that creates things being reproduced. And I'm constantly going back to two key figures in history Bakhtin, who is this Russian philosopher, and he was involved with Husserl in a sense, and he in a sense had already combined Husserl and Marx. And I'm not going for the same sort of a synthesis between the two, because I think that there are other things that concern ourselves with, such as the work of Heidegger and things that have evolved throughout the Frankfurt School and the various readings of Kant, Hegel, Heidegger. But what I want to arrive at is the notion of how matter and form are two discrete components of consciousness, and how they are in some way interchangeable. So the idea that they are interchangeable within reason, interchangeable, that form can affect matter and matter can affect form. And we all know, all those who have read Aristotle fully know this idea that matter and form are considered reflexively predicable of one another. So in that sense, there's the idea that one is putting oneself in a problematic situation where matter and form are reflexively interchangeable. Or one could say, in this particular instance, with what I'm trying to do, is I'm trying to posit reality as something I call symbolic being. So symbolic being is something that is detached from matter. The post-structuralists call it socio-symbolization. So it's the social identity of the person involved in it is symbolized as such, and then is not reflexively sort of appropriated in terms of their identity from the causal nexus of reality, as it were, the horizon of production, and appropriated as an ontic, Heidegger's word ontic content, that would result in some sort of physical harm or something to a subject. Instead, what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to take the idea of symbolization as a form of realizing the genus of things that originate at varying points in time and space, but it's particular to the subject, in that the subject has the idea that the symbolization has a lot to do with their quotidian practices, the actual things in which they are engaging, the things they are looking at, the things they are viewing, the pictures they see in the sort of semiotic context of signifier and signified, with the object in between. But here seeing the signifier as really the image, and the essence of it is the signifier, or the image sign in the mind, is the symbolic being. It's this revelation of an image in the mind, and the object is, of course, the sphere of activity affiliated with that as a reproduced concept. And insofar as it is reproduced and has been produced by varying forms of real production and actual production that are not just sort of involuntary concepts that are arriving in the mind of the person that is realizing some sort of Freudian, elevation of their subconscious into some things that they are seeing in their mind, such as certain sort of, filmmakers would say that they had just seen this image in their mind, or someone that was having some sort of transcendental experience would just say, I just saw the truth, and I saw this, and therefore I engaged in a process whereby I realized myself, and it turned out to be true, and so on and so forth. So things sort of work their way through this theoretical process in the mind of the subject. But it's also involved with the process of whether or not it is, using the linguistic term diachronic or synchronic, whether or not it's something from the past. The image, I think of the image as something that can be diachronic. It's something you're reflecting upon from the past. It's a diachronic image. It's an image sign. It's something you have seen as a reflection. And whereas the synchronic would be, this is happening now. This is the now. This is the event. This is the direction to take. And making that distinction requires an entirely different process than the one I was previously describing. For instance, that would add confusion to the components of of how to sort of engage the gap as something that was sort of cohered within the mind as something very salient and would involve the very things of which I'm discussing, the social praxis, the practice of being a quotidian humanoid that was looking for something intrinsic to their own particularity, and the particularity would be sort of engaged with the very form of production that was not just this Freudian elevation into consciousness of all their wishes, suppressed wishes and dreams and aspirations and all these things that are entirely put into this sort of process of psychoanalysis. Instead, it would be the experience of really not cutting that. You don't want to cut that or cut it up. Of course, it's not to cut that up, but it is what it is to do is to entirely erase it. One would not want to entirely erase the ideas that one has about what one's particular experiences in the world have been. What I would say rather, what would be a good idea is to just, as in the beginning, we were essentially matter and form. So an idea has to have to it its form, and if its form is temporalized in space. The form of something is temporalized in space. So one has to realize where the space is, and if it has to do with this consistent sort of self-realization and renewal of the experience of reality, then it is part of the process of self-identification, where self-identification becomes this process of self-realization that is based upon the notions that are formed by a very long process where judgments essentially are no longer sort of about precision, but about reflection and about arriving at the creation of a clear space between the actuality of the subject as matter and also form, but more matter. Only the form in terms of its ontological form, that it is being. It is being in terms of its form. So that is not detachable. That is, I would express the notion that I am being entirely essentialistic here, and to contradict myself as a sort of, we're pursuing existential realism as a sort of evocative moment whereby the transparencies of human becoming are about transforming reality into matter and form as two discrete entities, that matter is, that corporeal being could actually be an entity, is something I want to try to escape. So what I'm trying to give to subjectivity is the idea that it's not just simply matter, it also can be form, and that's very much sort of a function of the Aristotelian project. And following in that sense, I would like to think of things as very horizontal rather than vertical, for I feel that hierarchical entities are somewhat unnecessary to the process, yet it can be, if insofar as you concern yourself with thinking of them as unnecessary, you realize through the work of Husserl, for instance, the idea of the vertical noetic stratum, which indicates the possibility for something that can be sort of transmitted to social production, in the sense of thinking of Husserl and Marx together, that can be something that is that is part of produced reality. That's what we visualize. And sometimes getting into the situation whereby we're trying to contextualize reality insofar as we try to actually arrive at the particular subject and in situ in their particular situation and view them and so on and so forth. And he has the architectonic of the house, creates this sort of house that is the sort of basis for aesthetic seeing, as Bakhtin puts it. But to arrive at, to get into a world where one is being scrutinized in this way is not what would perhaps be an escape from the reality that we would want to be part of our quotidian experience. So the process whereby we arrive at this in terms of how we examine those phenomena, the phenomena and the sort of moral adjudication of the phenomena affiliated with how this is descriptive of the human experience, is more in keeping with the ontology which is proposed. Thank you for watching.